objective is to identify when this, what we call the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC rules, when they actually will govern and control the transaction. So you're typically looking in Article 2 of the UCC. You can, if you have extra time, you can Google UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, if you would like to read it. But that's sort of, if you were taking a class in law school, you would oftentimes buy the Uniform Commercial Code articles that you would study in the course, because you would be referencing those rules. They're sort of the foundation for where we start this area. So part of it is, again, identifying the sale transaction, but then also kind of looking at lease transactions and what the differences are there: consumer lease, finance lease. So the UCC, a lot of times when you're if you're a defendant, someone sues you and says you didn't follow through on your obligation of the sales contract. Oftentimes, the first place to defend that is to say, "Oh, I'm not governed by the UCC because of X, because this was a sale of services," for example. So that is sort of where the heart of this first chapter is can you identify that the UCC is actually going to apply? The complex ones would be when there's a mixture. You see that on your next learning objective slide. So sometimes there's services provided along with goods. Real estate is typically not a sale of good, but sometimes there's goods provided with the real estate. So these are more complex transactions that the courts have had to sort of draw a line and say, yes, we're going to apply the UCC, or no, we're not. So we still have some of the same issues. So as a quick review, and most of you on the essays on the midterm did a nice job of explaining offer and acceptance rules. When can the contract be revoked? Is there adequate consideration? And because we're going to be in the sales area, right, and we're talking about what contracts must be in writing, typically we see that our sales contracts have to be when they're for sale of goods over $500. The nice thing about having a UCC is it sort of creates a standard system for us throughout our country of deciding and determining when the sale must take place, when the sale is valid, if there is a breach, what kind of damages are awarded. So by default, or when in doubt, you sort of can always go back to this premise that's in this slide 6 here. If your transactions is housed within the UCC, then there's a presumption that our parties are going to act in good faith. That also means that they're not going to enter into unconscionable contracts or illegal contracts. But generally speaking, as long as the underlying transaction is not illegal, or the terms themselves are not unconscionable, or there's other, it's not with a minor, and other things we've learned from contracts law, the default position is that the parties can put into a contract whatever they'd like to. So again, just like in contract law, the courts aren't there to make sure that the transaction was fair, that it was an exactly equal transaction. When I use the word fair, the courts are there to make sure that it's not unconscionable, that it wasn't so one-sided or took advantage of another party. So here's sort of we draw a line here saying, there's UCC transactions when we're looking at the real estate area. So if we're talking about removing and extracting things from the land, typically we're going to be governed by the real estate law. If our buyer is going to, from our own land, if our buyer is trying to, let's say, purchase, we have an example there, the crops, like we would have someone come in and as a sharecropper and take the crops off the land. The UCC can govern a buyer here if it's not harming the underlying land. So, and then if our seller is removing the the trees and selling them, reselling them to a buyer, that would also still be under the UCC rules. So, if you're talking about taking off um, things that are intentionally grown on the land, the crops, the timber, then that can still stay in the UCC. Um, but if you're taking things, extracting things from the ground, so that's more like minerals, gas, um, oil, then we're back over the real estate law. So this line is a very difficult line to draw in the UCC, and so you'll see some problems asking, if it's a real estate transaction, where does it fit? Um, Going back really far back, we're back in, well, not really far, relatively speaking, but in our legal system, really far back. You're in the 1700s, and we know that our legal system is premised in the English court system. Um, And typically, those rules said merchants work it out yourselves. If someone gives you a bad deal once, you're not likely to do business with them again. Um, but over time, and as transactions became more valuable, more complex, um, there was sort of a need for this law to develop. So you have Article 2, which is the sale of goods, and then you have Article 2A, where you're talking about leasing the goods. Um, Typically, you're looking for two set leases, consumer leases and finance leases. And there's a CISCA. I always want to call it CISCA for the Animal Adoption Agency, but CISG is the sort of governing law here that's international. So the UCC is going to house the transactions that are domestic, and then you have an international sort of transaction governing doctrine that's typically accepted in most transactions that are international in nature. So, what's interesting under the UCC rule, different from contract rules, is mirror image rule. That rule no longer is required. Um, so we have a rule that basically says acceptance may sometimes differ slightly from the offer that was presented. If a term isn't defined, the UCC can um, plug in or essentially fill in that term to a reasonable term. So maybe we forgot to mention um, the date of pickup. Um, the UCC could fill in when the date of pickup of the item would be. A merchant's firm offer is sort of a key term that we'll cover here within the lecture. But those are offers that are sort of held in the highest standard of the UCC, that if a merchant makes a firm offer, then that offer is going to have to be held open and available. Some things you've already studied from contracts law will still come up. So the statute of frauds, the parole evidence rules are both things you're going to consider see. And what you should understand about the SIGS rules, the international standards, is that they're very similar in nature to the UCC. So without studying them separately, if you sort of default to understand the UCC rules, there's a few variations, but for the most part, you're going to have the exact same standard apply for accounting students, although there's a lot of variations between GAAP and IFRS. Sort of fundamental concepts are going to be the same, and you see the same thing here um, under the UCC and sales transaction laws. So we know, sort of on the key takeaways, the parties are forming a contract, they're acting in good faith, it's not unconscionable, it's not illegal. We're talking about the sale of goods. We have special rules when a merchant is selling something, and there can be some open terms within the transaction that the UCC takes on that will essentially fill in those terms. So some of our key terms are listed out here. Make sure you're kind of familiar with these as you're doing the reading. a merchant firm offer comes up in this chapter. Um, we'll see it in the subsequent chapters. But this merchant firm offer, the concept there is that you have a merchant, someone who's normally selling the goods. Um, the merchant is going to write and sign an offer, and it gives an assurance that that offer will be held open for a set period of time. So a merchant firm offer is sort of the highest standard of the UCC, saying that that merchant must keep that offer open for our potential buyer. So here's the rest of our terms here, and then we'll get to our practice problem. So if you'd like to put it on pause here and decide, would the UCC govern this transaction? And given the length, I'm going to just go ahead and make three quick videos for the three chapters we have. I apologize. I thought we'd be able to squeeze it into two lectures, but we'll do three here. So this is your first of the three, and we'll come back with the practice problem answer. So here, our doctor is not liable. And the main reason is well, let me get the separate spot area here. Sorry, I'm going to give you some notes. But the doctor isn't governed by the UCC. And the main reason that happens is because Dr. Poor is not a merchant. He's not not selling the ointment, the salve that was used in the office there. So he wasn't trying to sell this medicine to Pat. So here we wouldn't raise, now that this isn't saying that the doctor couldn't be sued for other reasons, for negligence, if he put an expired cream on the client, or he knew the client had an allergy and still used the cream. I mean, there's a lot of other tort legal issues that may come up.